3 days ago, I was blocked at a desert resort gate like a stranger to my own blood. This morning, they called demanding $45,000 for the wedding I was banned from. Some families never invite you to the table, only your signature to the guarantor line. I will not merely refuse this bill. I will force them all to face the true price of the greed and lies they signed for in my place. My name is Madison Hudson. I am 36 years old, living in a quiet neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, professionally. I am the Director of Contract Compliance at Alderon Contract Systems. My entire career is built on a foundation of noticing things other people miss. I hunt for hidden liabilities. I tear apart poorly drafted agreements, and I ensure that every financial commitment is backed by undeniable proof. I am paid to be cold, precise, and entirely immune to emotional manipulation in the boardroom. Yet, on a seemingly ordinary Monday morning, I found myself applying those exact same corporate survival skills to my own flesh and blood. I was sitting alone at the island in my sunlit kitchen. The house was completely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. The coffee in my mug had long gone cold, a dark, bitter pool reflecting the harsh light pouring in through the window. It had been exactly 3 days since the incident. 3 days since I was humiliated, stopped by private security guards, and turned away at the gates of my own younger brother's wedding. I was still trying to mentally process the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it. The sensation of being treated like a dangerous trespasser by my own family was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I was staring blankly at the marble countertop, wondering how decades of shared history could evaporate so quickly. When my cell phone vibrated and broke the silence, the caller identification displayed a number with an Arizona area code. For a brief, foolish second, a part of me thought it might be my brother Grant. I thought perhaps the wedding haze had faded, and he was calling to offer some pathetic, guilt-ridden apology for abandoning me at the entrance of Ember Canyon Estate in Sedona. I answered the phone. The voice on the other end did not belong to my brother. It was a woman with the smooth, relentlessly polite tone of someone who handles the financial messes of the wealthy on a daily basis. She introduced herself as an accounting specialist for the resort. She informed me, maintaining that infuriatingly professional cheerfulness, that the credit card kept on file to cover the final payment for the Hudson wedding had just been declined by the processor. She then paused, waiting for me to panic. Before cheerfully dropping the total, she told me the outstanding balance was exactly $45,000. I did not scream. I did not drop the phone. I did not burst into tears or launch into a hysterical rant about how I was not even allowed to step foot on the property. A normal sister might have shattered her cold coffee mug against the kitchen wall. But my professional instincts, honed by years of corporate combat, instantly overrode my personal shock. When faced with a massive, inexplicable financial liability, you do not react with emotion. You react with process. You demand the paper trail. My voice was entirely flat and devoid of any warmth when I spoke. I told the accounting specialist to stop talking immediately. I instructed her to generate a complete digital export of the entire billing file. I demanded the master venue contract, every single signed addendum, the full chronological payment history, and the complete electronic internet protocol logs verifying the guarantor confirmation. The woman hesitated. She stammered something vague about data privacy policies and needing managerial approval. I cut her off without raising my voice. I informed her that if she was officially attempting to collect a debt of $45,000 from me across state lines, I was legally entitled to examine the underlying documentation right that very second. I stayed on the line, breathing evenly into the receiver, listening to the hollow, frantic sound of her keyboard clicking. I did not speak another word until the email notification chimed loudly on my laptop sitting on the kitchen table. I opened the attached files. My eyes scanned the digital documents with the cold, ruthless efficiency of an auditor. The true shock did not come from the total amount at the bottom of the invoice. Although $45,000 is an absolutely staggering sum for a final balance on an event that was supposed to be fully funded, the shock, the cold realization that stopped the breath in my throat. came from the billing information at the very top of the page. The debt was not tied to Madison Hudson. It was not linked to my personal checking account or my personal credit cards. It was billed to an entity called Hudson Ledger Advisory. Hudson Ledger Advisory was a limited liability company I had opened many years ago for a brief, relatively unsuccessful freelance consulting project. I had completely abandoned the company long before I took my current high-level corporate job. It was a ghost entity, an empty shell of paperwork sitting dormant and forgotten in the state taxation archives. Yet here it was, perfectly resurrected on a high-definition screen, listed as the sole primary financial guarantor for a luxury destination wedding in the desert. I scrolled down to the itemized list of charges. The sheer audacity of the expenses was nauseating. This was not a simple miscalculation of catering costs or an extra hour of photography. This was a grotesque, unrestrained shopping spree executed by people who firmly believed they were playing with endless, consequence-free money. There was a massive charge for a rare vintage liquor tasting bar set up exclusively for the reception. There was a ridiculous fee for synchronized confetti cannons programmed to fire off during the first dance. I saw an invoice for a private rooftop after-party, complete with a secondary premium disc jockey and midnight custom catering. There was a premium morning after brunch reserved for 50 very important guests. There were exorbitant charges for upgrading the entire bridal party to luxury private villas. And then, nestled quietly near the bottom of the ledger, was a vaguely worded, highly suspicious line item labeled as an emergency decoration fee. None of these extravagant items were in the original, supposedly modest budget my brother had discussed with me months ago. They were late-stage additions, frantic and greedy upsells approved in the final frantic weeks leading up to the ceremony, and someone had to legally sign for them to authorize the resort to provide the services. I clicked open the electronic confirmation document. My stomach turned to absolute ice. The guarantor authorization form utilized the old employer identification number assigned to Hudson Ledger Advisory. The signature resting at the bottom of the page was technically mine, but it was perfectly flat, completely lacking the natural pressure variation and ink bleed of a live pen stroke. It was clearly a scanned copy of my signature, digitally lifted from some old, forgotten family document. Furthermore, the contact email address listed for the authorized corporate representative was a defunct work email address that I had not logged into for over 4 years. I unmuted the phone. The accounting specialist was still waiting on the other end, her breathing shallow and nervous over the line. I did not yell, but I injected every ounce of my corporate authority into my next words. I ordered Ember Canyon Estate to immediately freeze all attempts to charge the declined card on file. I instructed the woman to formally document, in writing, that the supposed guarantor was initiating a complete dispute of the entire balance. I stated with absolute clarity that the dispute was based on severe suspicions of corporate identity theft, forged authorization signatures, and fraudulent interstate financial misrepresentation. The woman sputtered, her polished customer service script completely abandoning her in the face of legal threats. She frantically promised to escalate the matter to the resort director of finance and their internal legal team within the hour. I told her I expected a follow-up email confirming the account freeze within 15 minutes, or I would have my own attorneys contact them before lunch. Then, I ended the call. The kitchen was plunged back into complete silence. The morning sun was still bright, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but the warmth was entirely gone. The truth settled over my shoulders like a heavy, leaden blanket. Just 3 days ago, standing in the dry heat at the dusty security gate of the estate, I had felt the sharp, agonizing sting of personal family rejection. I had actually believed my mother when she looked me in the eye and said I was too emotionally stressful to be around. I had believed I was simply an unwanted guest, a dark cloud excluded from the festivities to protect the pristine, wealthy image of my brother and his new bride's powerful family. But staring at the fraudulent financial contracts glowing on my laptop screen, the reality of my situation became terrifyingly clear. This entire situation was never about my attitude. This was never about underlying family tension or protecting the delicate bride from sibling drama. My forced absence was not an unfortunate consequence of a sudden family argument. It was a strictly required, structural step in a premeditated financial crime. They desperately needed me locked outside the venue, so I would not see the synchronized confetti cannons going off. They needed me kept far away from the reception, so I would not question the source of the rare vintage liquor flowing freely at the bar. They barred me from the property using private security, so I would remain completely blind to the fact that they were treating my stolen corporate identity like an unlimited, invisible line of credit. This was a coldly calculated fraud. It was a scheme orchestrated by the very people who shared my last name, planned and executed long before I ever packed my bags to fly to Arizona. They did not just betray me as an older sister. They targeted me as a financial mark. And as I sat there, staring at the forged signature of my own ghost company, the last lingering shred of my familial loyalty withered and died. I closed the laptop with a soft, final click. I was no longer a grieving sister nursing a bruised heart and seeking an apology. I was the director of contract compliance. Someone had just breached a contract using my name, and I was going to make sure every single one of them paid the absolute maximum penalty, exactly 7 days before the ceremony. My cell phone lit up with a message from Grant. We had not spoken in roughly 6 months, a thick, uncomfortable silence born from my ultimate refusal to co-sign yet another luxury auto loan for him. But his text carried the desperate, soft tone of a brother wanting to wipe the slate clean before the biggest day of his life. He wrote that he really wanted me there. He promised, with what felt like genuine sincerity, that things were different in the family now. I stared at those glowing words on my screen for a long time, letting the foolish, persistent hope of an older sister override my usual corporate skepticism. Against my better judgment, against every instinct that told me to stay away, I rearranged my entire professional schedule. I delegated 3 major compliance audits at Alderon Contract Systems, hastily packed a carry-on suitcase, and booked a direct flight to Arizona. I did not want to show up to the desert empty-handed. I wanted to bring something that signified roots, something that proved we were a family despite our deep fractures and historical arguments. I drove to a specialty horologist downtown and retrieved our late grandfather's vintage pocket watch. I spent a considerable amount of money having the tarnished brass meticulously polished and the intricate internal gears completely restored to working order. It was a heavy, beautiful piece of our shared history, resting perfectly inside a custom velvet box. I wrapped it carefully, foolishly believing it would be the perfect olive branch for a brother starting a new chapter of his life. The drive from the regional airport to Sedona was blindingly bright. The massive red rock formations loomed in the distance, ancient and entirely indifferent, baking under the relentless 90-degree sun. The air conditioning in my rental sedan fought a losing battle against the heat. When I finally pulled up to the massive, imposing wrought iron gates of Ember Canyon Estate, the heat radiating off the black asphalt was visibly shimmering. A private security guard in a crisp white shirt and a tactical belt stepped out of the shaded booth. He carried an electronic tablet, leaned down to my window, and politely asked for my first and last name. I gave it to him, offering a tired but genuine smile. I watched his thick fingers swipe down the glowing screen. Then, he swiped up. Then, he frowned, the polite customer service mask slipping just a fraction. He asked me to spell my last name again. I did, enunciating every single letter clearly. He shook his head, his professional demeanor hardening into a rigid wall of protocol. He told me, quite firmly, that I was not on the approved guest registry for the weekend. I let out a small, confused laugh, automatically assuming it was a simple clerical error made by an overworked planner. I explained patiently that I was the groom's older sister. I told him I had a luxury villa reserved under my name for the entire 3-day weekend. The guard tapped the screen a few more times, his expression tightening further. He did not apologize. He informed me, in a flat, unyielding voice, that the accommodation reservation under my name had been officially canceled exactly 48 hours ago by the primary event coordinator. My chest tightened as if a physical band had been snapped around my ribs. The dry desert air suddenly felt far too thick to breathe. The smile died on my lips. I asked him to call the main house immediately, to get Grant on the radio, to fix whatever catastrophic administrative disaster had just occurred. The guard stepped back from my vehicle and made a brief, hushed radio call. I sat in my idling car, the fan blowing warm air against my face, my fingers gripping the velvet box on the passenger seat so tightly my knuckles turned white. 10 agonizing minutes passed. The heavy iron gates remained firmly shut. Instead of my brother running down the hill, a sleek, silent electric golf cart approached from the winding, manicured driveway inside the property. It was not Grant. It was our mother, Elaine Hudson. She stepped out of the cart with perfect, terrifying composure. Her blonde hair was immaculately styled, unaffected by the desert wind, and her expensive linen resort wear was completely unwrinkled. There was absolutely no shock on her face when she saw me standing there by my dusty rental car. There was no maternal concern, no frantic apology for a terrible, heartbreaking misunderstanding. She walked toward me with the calm, measured, deliberate steps of a woman executing a flawlessly predetermined strategy. I stepped out of the vehicle, the oppressive heat instantly wrapping around my legs like a heavy blanket. I asked her what in the world was going on, my voice betraying a slight, humiliating tremble that I absolutely despised. Elaine did not reach out to hug me. She did not even offer a comforting touch on the arm. She stopped exactly an arm's length away, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses to shield her eyes from the glare. She looked at me not as her eldest daughter, but as a severe logistical problem she had successfully neutralized. She spoke in a low, chillingly cold tone, ensuring the security guard standing a few yards away could not hear the pure venom laced in her words. She told me that her new daughter-in-law's family was very particular about their social standing. She explained, with a sickeningly calm voice, that the Mercers were keeping a very careful watch over their public image, especially with so many prominent local investors attending the reception this weekend. She folded her arms across her chest, a defensive physical barrier, and delivered the killing blow with practiced, effortless ease. She said it would simply be better for everyone involved if I did not come inside the gates. She told me that everyone inside had already been warned that I sometimes cause immense stress and emotional instability when I am around the family. The words struck me with actual physical force, knocking the breath out of my lungs. I stood completely paralyzed on the scorching pavement. My own mother had not just uninvited me at the last possible second, she had actively, maliciously campaigned against me behind my back. She had painted me to a wealthy family of total strangers as a hysterical, mentally unstable liability just to legally justify locking me out of the venue. She had turned my mere presence into a toxic threat. The sheer, unadulterated humiliation of it burned significantly hotter than the Arizona sun beating down on my bare shoulders. I looked deep into her eyes, desperately searching for a flicker of maternal guilt, a tiny hint of regret for what she was doing. There was absolutely nothing. I saw only the hard, polished, impenetrable surface of a woman viciously protecting her own social interests and her son's upward mobility. I stood my ground and waited for Grant. I waited for the groom, the very boy I had bailed out of crippling credit card debt time and time again over the last decade, to come rushing down that driveway to tell our mother she was acting insane. I waited for him to defend me, but the long driveway remained entirely empty. The silence of the desert was deafening. Then, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out with shaking hands, the screen glaring in the sunlight. It was a text message from Grant. It was short, breathtakingly cowardly, and utterly devastating. He wrote, "Do not make a mess. I will explain later." That was it. That was the sum total of my worth to my only brother. A quick, spineless text message sent from the safety of a luxury suite to ensure his discarded sister did not cause an embarrassing scene outside his playground. The humiliation was finally complete. It coated the back of my throat like ash, making it completely impossible to swallow. I did not scream at the gates. I did not throw a violent tantrum, which would only serve to prove Elaine's vicious lies right. I simply reached back into the sweltering car, picked up the velvet box containing our grandfather's meticulously restored watch, and held it out to her. Elaine took it without a single word of thanks, her expression remaining entirely blank. I turned my back on her without saying goodbye. I got back into the rental car, shoved the gear shift into reverse, and backed away from the iron gates, leaving my family behind me in the dust. I drove slowly toward the exit of the outer gravel parking lot, my mind a swirling, chaotic vortex of blinding anger and profound, bottomless grief. I felt completely hollowed out, entirely erased from my own family lineage by a single, calculated conversation at a security checkpoint. But just as I reached the final stop sign before merging onto the main dusty highway, a flash of white caught my eye. It was a temporary wooden service directory board, set up discreetly near the hidden loading dock meant strictly for delivery trucks and hired vendors. It listed the complex delivery schedules, the direct contact numbers for the luxury florists, the catering crew, and the primary event planners. And there, typed clearly in bold black letters under a section specifically labeled for emergency vendor payments, was a name I had not seen or thought about in years. It was not Grant's name. It was not the wealthy bride's name. It read, Hudson Ledger Advisory. I slammed my foot on the brakes. The car jerked to a violent halt, kicking up a cloud of red dust. I stared at the sign through the tinted windshield, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against my ribs. To a normal person, it was a tiny, completely insignificant logistical detail hidden in a sea of event planning jargon. But to a woman who spent her entire adult life professionally auditing complex corporate contracts, it was a massive, glaring, impossible anomaly. Why on earth would my defunct, abandoned corporate entity be listed on a vendor directory board for a wedding I was just explicitly banned from attending? The heavy grief threatening to crush me vanished in an instant, immediately replaced by a sharp, cold, razor-thin spike of professional suspicion. The very first thorn of a much darker, much more sinister truth had just been violently planted in my mind. I took a slow, deep breath, memorizing every single name and number listed on that wooden board, and finally pressed the accelerator, merging onto the highway. I was physically driving away from Ember Canyon Estate, but mentally, my mind was already turning back around, quietly preparing to tear the entire elaborate event apart piece by piece. I moved from the kitchen island to my dedicated home office, a room designed specifically for untangling complex corporate messes. The walls were lined with heavy reference manuals and legal statutes. I sat down in my leather ergonomic chair, woke up my primary desktop computer, and bypassed the emotional processing unit of my brain entirely. I was no longer operating as a discarded family member. I was functioning entirely as the director of contract compliance. My first action was establishing a perimeter. I opened a blank word processing document and drafted a formal but aggressive notice of dispute. I addressed it to the general manager of the resort, the primary legal counsel of their parent hospitality group, and the compliance officer of the third-party payment processing company. I utilized the most severe legal terminology available, explicitly citing suspected interstate wire fraud and unauthorized commercial representation. I copied my personal attorney, Rowan Pike, on the final draft. Rowan is a notoriously ruthless litigator whose entire boutique practice revolves around unwinding commercial liability and corporate fraud. He does not negotiate. He simply dismantles the opposition. I hit send, ensuring the email requested read receipts from every single recipient. With the initial defensive wall built, I pivoted to the offensive investigation. I needed to understand exactly how the breach occurred. I opened a secure web browser and navigated to the login portal of the defunct email provider associated with my old business. It had been nearly half a decade since I last accessed that inbox. The system immediately flagged my login attempt from an unrecognized device and demanded secondary verification. It took me nearly 45 minutes of answering obscure security questions regarding my childhood pets and high school addresses to finally force a manual password override. Once inside the inbox, I ignored the thousands of unread promotional messages and navigated straight to the back-end security settings. I pulled the master access log. The digital footprint was pristine and undeniably damning. The log revealed that an anonymous user had initiated a master password reset exactly 2 months ago. The reset protocol had cleverly bypassed my current mobile device and routed a voice verification code to a secondary, legacy recovery number. I stared at the 10 digits glowing on the screen. I recognized the sequence immediately. It was the landline anchored to the kitchen wall of my parents' house in the suburbs. I dug deeper into the server data. The logs provided a specific internet protocol address for that initial fraudulent login session. I ran a standard geolocation trace using a basic network utility tool. The digital map on my screen zoomed in, dropping a bright red pin on a residential broadband node located in Westerville, Ohio. That is the quiet, affluent suburb where my parents have resided for the past 30 years. The people stealing from me were not operating out of some anonymous foreign server farm. The theft was originating from the exact same living room where we used to open holiday presents. The realization prompted my next move. I logged into the encrypted cloud storage server, where our family historically maintained a shared archive for essential paperwork, tax documents, and property deeds. Many years ago, when I was fresh out of graduate school, I had created a specific digital folder for my early, ultimately unsuccessful business ventures. I clicked the directory icon. The folder was completely empty. The high-resolution digital scans of my federal employer identification number were gone. The original state limited liability company registration certificates had been deleted. The clean copies of my driver license and a specific digital scan of my physical signature were entirely missing. I checked the administrative modification history of the folder. The files had been systematically downloaded and then permanently purged from the server exactly 9 weeks ago. Someone had meticulously harvested my corporate identity while I was busy running audits for Alderon Contract Systems. My cell phone rang, shattering the quiet hum of my office. It was Rowan Pike. His voice was completely devoid of professional pleasantries, a gravelly tone that meant he had already found something severe. Rowan informed me that he had immediately pulled the state business registry records the second he received my email. He discovered that my dormant company had not just been used, it had been formally, legally resurrected. Someone had filed the necessary administrative paperwork, paid the outstanding franchise tax penalties, and submitted a statement of continued existence to the Secretary of State. He explained their strategy, his voice laced with grim professional respect for the sheer audacity of the crime. By administratively reactivating the limited liability company, they established a legally valid corporate entity to serve as the financial shield. When they booked the luxury vendors, the high-end caterers, and the resort accommodations, they did so under the business name. This created a thick corporate veil, making the entire massive debt look like a standard, highly enforceable business-to-business transaction rather than a reckless personal shopping spree. They deliberately engineered the paperwork so that if anyone investigated, it would appear as a simple corporate liability, insulating them from immediate personal criminal charges of identity theft. I did not waste time expressing shock. I instructed Rowan to immediately draft a formal cease and desist order directed at the state registry, contesting the fraudulent reinstatement. While he spoke, I opened a parallel browser window and accessed the commercial banking portal. I initiated a hard, permanent freeze on the single commercial checking account still loosely tied to that old business profile, an account that thankfully only held a few $100s. I systematically filled out the bank fraud affidavits, ensuring the specific checkbox for suspected interstate corporate identity theft was marked in red. I was actively building a fortress of legal deniability, brick by tedious brick. Then came the final, most sickening revelation of the afternoon. I opened a blank spreadsheet to visualize the data. I am a visual thinker, and I needed to see the architecture of their lie. I entered the date of the email breach. I logged the date the business was legally revived with the state. I pulled the vendor timeline from the resort documents and entered the specific dates the initial. Massive non-refundable deposits were authorized and processed. Finally, I scrolled through my personal phone messages and looked at the exact date Grant had sent me that text message. The text where he claimed he wanted to make amends. The text where he begged for my presence at the ceremony. I overlaid his message onto the master timeline. The numbers did not lie. The very first fraudulent payment, a massive deposit of $15,000 for the venue securing fee, was authorized and processed a full 5 days before Grant ever reached out to invite me. The timeline was entirely backward. The sudden, heartwarming invitation from my estranged brother was never a genuine olive branch. It was never about healing our fractured relationship. The invitation was simply the final, necessary piece of the cover-up. They desperately needed me to physically show up to the desert. They needed me to be photographed on the premises, to drink the champagne, and to establish a verifiable geographic presence at the event. If the third-party payment processor or the resort management ever flagged the massive, irregular charges originating from an Ohio-based company, the venue could easily point to the fact that the corporate guarantor was physically attending the festivities in Arizona. My physical presence was intended to be their ultimate alibi. They only banned me at the very last second because they realized the charges had ballooned so grotesquely out of control that keeping me ignorant inside the venue was impossible. The risk of me seeing the luxury vendors and asking questions outweighed the benefit of having me as a visual alibi. I closed the spreadsheet. The screen went dark, reflecting my own face back at me. The dull, heavy ache of family betrayal was completely gone, entirely burned away by the cold, clarifying light of a financial investigation. I was no longer a wounded sibling trying to understand why I was not loved enough to witness a vow exchange. The objective was no longer about reclaiming my fractured self-esteem, seeking validation, or demanding a tearful apology from my mother and brother. The objective was ruthlessly simple. I was going to track down every single individual who handled that fraudulent paperwork. I was going to find out exactly who sat in that suburban house and used my name as an unlimited line of credit. I was going to build an impenetrable, suffocating case of financial fraud, and I was going to legally destroy them all. I began to reconstruct the social architecture of the marriage itself. To understand a financial crime thoroughly, you have to understand the underlying motive. And the motive is rarely just about acquiring cash. It is almost always about acquiring status. I dug deep into the public profiles of the bride and her extended family. The Mercers were not just comfortably wealthy, they were entrenched local royalty in their county. The father of the bride ran a highly influential private equity firm specializing in commercial real estate and luxury commercial developments. They moved in exclusive circles where multi-million-dollar investments were discussed casually over Sunday afternoon brunches. And into this wealthy shark tank swam my brother. Grant had always possessed a dangerous amount of charm. The kind of easy and effortless smile that made people want to hand him things he had never actually earned. But charm does not pay a mortgage on a luxury high-rise penthouse, and it certainly does not impress a private equity patriarch. So, Grant invented a completely new version of himself. He had somehow convinced the entire Mercer family that he was the founding partner of an aggressive and highly successful land development firm specializing in acquiring distressed properties. The reality was entirely pathetic. Grant was a mid-level independent contractor selling roofing and siding supplies on short-term commission structures. He had no equity, no staff, and no actual company to his name. He simply printed glossy business cards, bought expensive suits, and leased a foreign sports car he absolutely could not afford on a monthly basis. The entire destination wedding was never intended to be a romantic celebration of two people falling in love. It was a highly calculated and incredibly expensive theatrical performance. It was a capability showcase designed specifically to convince his new father-in-law that Grant belonged perfectly in their elite tax bracket. This elaborate show was positioning him for a massive influx of family investment capital immediately after the honeymoon concluded. There was only one massive and glaring threat to this carefully constructed house of cards: me. I was the solitary person on Earth who actually knew the unforgiving reality of his financial background. Over the past 4 years, I had quietly intercepted his financial disasters on 3 separate occasions. I paid off a crippling credit card balance when he was drowning in compounding interest and facing collection agencies. I wired him cash to stop his leased car from being repossessed by a tow truck at 2:00 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday. I covered a massive gap in his rent when he decided to lease a luxury downtown loft to impress a previous girlfriend. I knew the exact depth of his professional incompetence. If I had been allowed to walk freely through that reception, holding a glass of champagne and mingling with the Mercer family, the entire illusion would have been at severe risk. The father of the bride would have inevitably approached me, perhaps offering a firm handshake and asking polite but probing questions about my brother and his brilliant real estate ventures. He would have asked about the corporate structure, the current market trends, and the future financial projections of the imaginary company. Grant knew my professional nature perfectly well. He knew I do not lie to cover for incompetence. I would not have screamed or made a dramatic public scene, but a simple hesitation, a confused look, or a single clarifying question from me would have instantly cracked his flawless facade. I was a walking and breathing liability to his ultimate grift. This was precisely why Elaine had to step in and surgically remove me from the narrative. She had spent months carefully poisoning the well behind my back. I realize now that she must have woven a tragic and deeply convincing story for the Mercer family long before the physical invitations were even printed and mailed out. She painted a vivid picture of a bitter and fiercely jealous older sister who deeply resented her younger brother and his sudden massive success. She told them I was emotionally erratic, prone to unpredictable outbursts, and fundamentally unstable at large family gatherings. She sold them a lie so completely that when I finally arrived at the gate, the private security detail and the family of the bride viewed me not as an excluded relative, but as a genuine physical threat to the safety and elegance of the event. They were probably relieved when I was turned away at the perimeter. I was sitting in the dim light of my office, letting the sheer toxicity of my mother and her betrayal wash over me, when the screen of my cell phone suddenly lit up. The harsh glare illuminated the dark wood of my desk. It was a text message from an entirely unknown number. It was not a local area code, nor was it a number I recognized from any of my corporate contacts. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the text slowly. The words were simple, highly direct, and utterly chilling in their precision. The message read, "You were not just banned from the wedding. You were banned so you would not see the final cost." I stared at the glowing screen, my breath catching sharply in my throat. Before I could even formulate a rational thought or type a cautious response to the anonymous sender, a second message arrived from the exact same unknown number. It was an image file. I tapped the digital image to enlarge it on my screen. It was a slightly blurry and hastily taken photograph of a heavy-duty clipboard resting on a stainless steel catering prep table. The clipboard held a master logistical spreadsheet, the specific kind used by elite event planners to track every single moving piece of a massive production. I recognized the specific corporate formatting immediately. It was the internal command document exclusively used by the staff at Ember Canyon Estate. My eyes scanned quickly down the long rows of vendor schedules, lighting cues, and dietary restrictions until I found the section labeled VIP Guest Management. There was a smaller subsection right below it, specifically designated for potential security risks and access control. And there was my name, typed out in stark and uncompromising black ink. Next to my name was a highlighted column designated for operational instructions for the staff. The text in that box was not a polite note about seating arrangements or awkward family dynamics. It was a cold and clinical directive that perfectly summarized my entire existence within my own family unit. The note read, "Do not admit, financial only." I stared at those 5 words until they burned themselves permanently into my retinas. Do not admit, financial only. The final and most devastating twist of the knife was not that they lied to me, or that they stole from my business, or even that they dragged my professional reputation into their miserable financial scheme. The true horror was the absolute and clinical dehumanization of it all. In their eyes, I had never been a welcome guest. I had never been a cherished family member, an older sibling to be honored, or a daughter to be welcomed to the table. I was nothing more than a blind and silent funding mechanism. I was the invisible bank account strictly required to underwrite their pathetic performance of wealth. I was deliberately kept entirely out of the frame, so my physical reality would not ruin their beautiful and incredibly expensive photographs. They desperately wanted the vintage pocket watch I brought as a heartfelt gift, and they absolutely demanded the unlimited credit line attached to my stolen corporate identity. But they did not want the living, breathing woman attached to either of those things. The silence in my office was absolute and heavy. I did not shed a single tear. The deep and heavy sorrow that had been sitting squarely in my chest for the past 3 days evaporated completely into the air, replaced instantly by something entirely different. It was a pure, highly refined, and perfectly calibrated sense of purpose. They had successfully built their entire fictional kingdom using my name and my credit. But they had made one catastrophic and truly unforgivable miscalculation in their grand design. They completely forgot that I am the one who writes the contracts, and I am the exact person who ruthlessly enforces the maximum penalties when those contracts are broken. I set the phone down gently on the smooth surface of the desk. The anonymous message was the final piece of evidence I needed to cross the threshold of no return. I was no longer merely defending myself against a fraudulent corporate charge. I was actively preparing to dismantle every single lie they had ever told, and I was going to make sure they felt the exact weight of every single dollar they stole. I replied to the anonymous text message with a strict time and a remote location. I chose a rundown 24-hour diner located right off the interstate highway, roughly 30 miles away from my residential neighborhood to ensure absolute privacy. The sun had completely set by the time I pulled into the empty parking lot. I arrived 20 minutes early. The diner smelled strongly of stale coffee, old frying oil, and harsh industrial floor bleach. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, irritating hum. I chose a corner booth situated as far away from the windows as possible, facing the front entrance. I ordered a black coffee and waited in complete silence. Exactly at 8 in the evening, a young woman walked through the glass doors. She looked incredibly exhausted and deeply terrified. She was clutching a thick yellow folder tightly against her chest, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She scanned the room, locked eyes with me, and hurried over to slide into the opposite side of the cracked vinyl booth. She introduced herself as Nora Bell. She confirmed she was the junior assistant event planner employed directly by Ember Canyon Estate. Nora was shaking as the waitress dropped off a glass of ice water. She took a long sip and immediately started talking, her words spilling out in a frantic, hurried rush. She explained that she had been suffering from severe panic attacks since the weekend concluded. She saw the massive final invoices being generated. She personally heard the suspicious conversations happening behind closed doors. And when the primary credit card payment violently bounced that morning, she realized with horrifying clarity that she was unwittingly acting as an accessory to a massive financial crime. Nora told me she flatly refused to sacrifice her own career and potentially face criminal charges just to protect a wealthy bride and a lying groom. I told her to slow down. I asked her to tell me absolutely everything from the very beginning. Nora placed the folder flat on the sticky table and opened it. She started with my mother. Nora said Elaine was completely shameless about the financial arrangement. During the final venue walkthroughs, whenever a vendor respectfully warned the family that a specific request would severely exceed the established maximum budget, Elaine would just wave her hand dismissively in the air. Nora looked me dead in the eye and quoted my mother directly. She said Elaine had told the entire planning team to just push any overages to Madison and her company. Elaine had literally told a room full of strangers that I always clean up the family trash. Hearing my mother refer to my hard-earned money and my professional success as a personal trash disposal service made the blood run completely cold in my veins. It was a level of casual malice that I was still struggling to comprehend, but the revelations were just beginning. Nora reached into the folder and slid a thick stack of printed color screenshots across the table. They were digital captures of a private group messaging chat. The participants in the chat were Elaine, Grant, and someone simply named Sloan. It took my brain a fraction of a second to realize Sloane was the new bride, Sloane Mercer. Up until this exact moment, sitting in the diner, I had foolishly assumed Sloane was merely an ignorant beneficiary of my family and their grift. I genuinely thought she was just a wealthy girl completely unaware of how her luxury destination wedding was truly being funded. The printed messages resting under my fingertips proved I was entirely catastrophically wrong. Sloane was not just a willing participant. She was the primary architect of my physical exclusion. I read the printed chat logs line by line. Grant had expressed a moment of weak, pathetic panic in the group, worrying about what would happen if I actually showed up to the reception and started asking loud questions about the upgraded floral arrangements or the unlimited premium open bar. It was Sloane who provided the immediate, ruthless, and highly calculated solution. She typed that they simply could not risk me making a scene in the beautiful ballroom and ruining her perfect aesthetic. Sloane explicitly ordered the planning team to erase my name completely from the airport shuttle manifest. Sloane was the exact person who commanded the venue management to forcefully cancel my luxury suite booking. Sloane instructed them to have the private security team block me right at the front iron gate. She wanted me completely isolated, deeply humiliated, and physically trapped outside the perimeter before I could even set foot inside the main lobby. Nora let me digest the sheer cruelty of the messages before she pulled out her personal cell phone. She told me that sometimes she recorded audio during chaotic vendor meetings to ensure she did not miss any important logistical details or last-minute dietary changes. She played a short digital audio file she had captured entirely by accident while walking closely behind Grant and one of his groomsmen during a tuxedo fitting. The audio was slightly muffled by background noise, but Grant's voice was completely unmistakable. He was laughing loudly. He told his friend not to worry about the final astronomical cost of the bachelor party suite they had rented the night before. He laughed and told his friend that his older sister is a walking emergency fund. He added that as long as she is not standing anywhere near the official wedding photos, everything is completely fine. I sat perfectly still, letting the crude recording finish and echo in my mind. I did not blink. Grant did not just steal my corporate identity to fund his lies. He found the entire criminal process highly amusing. He viewed my exploitation as a funny joke to share with his friends. Nora put her phone away and leaned across the table to reveal the final piece of their billing strategy. I asked her directly why the luxury resort waited until Monday morning to process the massive final charge. Standard luxury hospitality protocol strongly dictates that all remaining balances must be settled in full before the actual ceremony officially begins. Nora explained that the head wedding planner was explicitly instructed by Elaine to hold the final massive invoice until the weekend was entirely over and the guests had all gone home. Elaine had analyzed my psychological profile perfectly. My mother genuinely believed that if the massive bill arrived after the wedding was totally finished, I would be so terrified of a public vendor dispute ruining my pristine professional reputation that I would quietly pay the entire $45,000 out of sheer corporate embarrassment. They expertly weaponized my entire career, my deep sense of responsibility, and my fear of public scandal completely against me. While Nora was finishing her sentence, my own cell phone began to vibrate repeatedly against the table surface. It was a rapid succession of urgent messages from a trusted childhood friend who still lived back in my hometown. She sent me dozens of digital screenshots from a local community page and a highly active private church group forum. Elaine was already executing her aggressive damage control campaign. My mother had drafted a long, highly emotional, and completely fabricated post claiming that her heart was completely broken. She wrote a wild story, stating that I had thrown a massive, selfish tantrum over money right before the beautiful ceremony, and that I had cruelly abandoned my younger brother on the most important day of his life. The comment section beneath her post was completely flooded with sympathetic messages from her friends, all universally condemning me for ruining a beautiful family moment with my supposed greed. The old version of Madison would have felt a desperate, burning need to defend herself against the lies. I would have typed out a frantic, highly emotional rebuttal online. I would have called my mother to scream at her through the phone. I would have desperately tried to explain my side of the true story to anyone who would listen to me. But sitting in that greasy diner, bathed in the harsh and unforgiving fluorescent light, I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. I did not type a single word in response to the online slander. I did not react at all. I simply placed my phone face down on the table. For the first time in my entire adult life, I truly realized that I did not need to win an exhausting emotional argument with my toxic family. I did not need to fight their pathetic public relations war on the internet. Emotional truth is fragile, subjective, and incredibly easily manipulated by a crying mother playing the victim. But I possess something infinitely stronger and far more dangerous than tears. I had a strict chronological timeline of events. I had the fraudulent Internet Protocol login data. I had the printed group chat logs explicitly proving the involvement of the wealthy bride. I had the digital audio recording of the groom admitting to the exploitation. And sitting directly across from me, drinking a glass of ice water in a diner off the highway, I had a living, breathing witness who was fully prepared to testify to all of it. I did not need to argue with them ever again. I just needed to let them continue digging their own massive grave. I thanked Nora sincerely for her courage, picked up the thick yellow folder containing the evidence, and walked out of the diner into the cool, dark night air. The frantic investigation phase was officially over. It was time to start building the trap. The relentless legal pressure exerted by Rowan Pike finally cracked the defensive posture of the resort. Faced with the immediate threat of a massive civil subpoena and potential accessory liability, the corporate legal team representing Ember Canyon Estate capitulated entirely. By late Tuesday afternoon, they surrendered the raw, unfiltered internal vendor logs. They transferred a massive encrypted file containing every single digital transaction, every internal markup, and the complete routing history of the $45,000 they were attempting to extract from my stolen company. I locked the door to my home office, poured a fresh cup of black coffee, and began to surgically dissect the data. As I cross-referenced the itemized receipts against standard industry pricing models, a glaring anomaly immediately presented itself. A massive portion of the outstanding balance was not attributed to actual physical goods or direct labor costs. Instead, nearly half of the total debt consisted of exorbitant administrative markups and emergency sourcing fees routed exclusively through a third-party vendor management company called Desert Vale Events. According to the ledgers, Desert Vale Events had been hired late in the planning process to secure the rare vintage liquor, source the synchronized confetti cannons, and coordinate the private rooftop after-party. However, the invoices they submitted to the resort were grotesquely inflated. They were charging a 300% markup on standard wholesale items and passing the completely fabricated premium directly to the Hudson Ledger Advisory account. I opened a separate investigative database and ran a comprehensive corporate background check on Desert Vale Events. I pulled their original articles of incorporation and their state tax registration filings. The managing director listed on the official state documents was a man named Preston Vance. I cross-referenced that name with the exhaustive social media research I had conducted on the bride. Preston Vance was not an independent, objective luxury event coordinator. He was the first cousin of Sloan Mercer. The sheer audacity of the scheme forced a bitter, humorless laugh from my chest. This was no longer just a case of my brother recklessly overspending to impress his wealthy new-in-laws. The Mercer family was actively participating in a sophisticated kickback operation. Sloan and her relatives had established a circular cash flow system. They hired their own family member to provide unnecessary luxury upgrades, allowed him to drastically inflate the final invoices, and then deliberately forwarded the massively padded bill to my stolen corporate entity. They were literally using my credit line to funnel cash directly back into their own pockets, effectively elevating their own social prestige while getting paid to do it. I turned my attention away from the Mercer family and focused the investigation directly back on my own blood. I needed concrete, undeniable proof of exactly how they acquired the specific physical documents required to bypass the secondary corporate security checks. I extracted the hidden digital metadata embedded deep within the scanned copies of my passport. my old business tax identification certificates, and my official banking signature card. The digital footprint embedded in the files revealed the specific hardware identification number of the machine used to scan the paperwork. It was a commercial-grade home office printer and scanner. I knew that exact model well. I had personally purchased it for my parents 5 years ago. For a brief, agonizing moment, a wave of profound nausea washed over me. I had to confront the terrifying possibility that my father, Robert Hudson, was an active co-conspirator in this financial slaughter. My father had always been a quiet, passive man who generally deferred to my mother, but actively participating in identity theft felt entirely out of character for him. I needed to eliminate the variable. I accessed the shared digital family calendar, a cloud-based schedule we historically used to track medical appointments. I matched the exact digital timestamp of the document scans against the calendar. The metadata proved the files were scanned and uploaded on a Tuesday afternoon exactly 2 months ago. According to the medical schedule, my father was attending a mandatory 3-hour cardiac rehabilitation session across town at that exact moment. He had suffered a mild health scare the previous year, and his attendance at the clinic was strictly monitored. My father was physically incapable of operating the scanner in the home office that afternoon. Elaine was completely alone in the house. The final piece of the physical puzzle clicked into place. 4 years ago, during a particularly chaotic transition between apartments, I had asked my parents to store a heavy plastic storage bin in their basement. The bin contained obsolete tax returns, expired passports, and the dead paperwork from my early unsuccessful business ventures. It was meant to be a secure, temporary solution that I eventually forgot about as my corporate career demanded all of my attention. I realized then that my mother had not simply stumbled across my information by accident. The metadata proved that the digital folders had been accessed and modified multiple times over a prolonged period. My mother had actively hunted for the information. She had gone down into the basement, broken the seal on my private storage bin, and systematically sifted through years of my discarded financial history until she found the exact legal instruments she needed to build her trap. Her decision to use the defunct limited liability company instead of my direct personal name was not a careless mistake. It was a highly calculated, deeply manipulative legal strategy. Elaine knew perfectly well that if she simply stole my personal credit card, the banking authorities would immediately classify the act as criminal identity theft, triggering a swift and brutal federal investigation. But by utilizing a dormant business entity, Elaine and Grant created a thick, muddy layer of commercial ambiguity. They firmly believed that if their scheme was ever discovered, they could easily dismiss the entire $45,000 theft as a simple internal business dispute or a family misunderstanding over corporate authorization. They thought they had engineered the perfect crime, insulated by the slow, bureaucratic nature of civil corporate litigation. They genuinely believed that the legal complexity of a business dispute would completely overwhelm me and force me to quietly settle the debt to avoid a prolonged public scandal. They drastically underestimated my capacity for total warfare. I did not hesitate. I opened the official portal for the State Attorney General and the Federal Trade Commission. I systematically submitted comprehensive, fully documented reports. I did not file a complaint about a family disagreement. I formally declared 4 distinct, severe allegations. I reported a coordinated campaign of corporate fraud. I filed charges for the unauthorized and malicious use of a business entity. I submitted the proof of forged authorization regarding the legal guarantor documents. And finally, I reported a complex case of interstate financial misrepresentation, explicitly naming Elaine Hudson, Grant Hudson, Sloan Mercer, and Preston Vance as the primary conspirators. By clicking the final submission button, I permanently pushed the entire situation far beyond the realm of a private family spat. There would be no tearful reconciliations in a therapist's office. There would be no hushed apologies over a holiday dinner. I had just initiated a cascade of formal legal investigations that could completely dismantle their lives, their credit scores, and their precious social standing. Sitting in the quiet darkness of my office, a profound and chilling realization settled deep into my bones. the massive financial theft orchestrated for this desert wedding was not an isolated incident. It was not a sudden, desperate moment of poor judgment from a brother trying to impress his bride. It was the final, inevitable evolution of a dynamic that had existed for over a decade. I looked back at the years of bailing Grant out of his careless debts, the constant emotional manipulation from Elaine demanding I support the family, and the endless expectation that my professional success existed solely to cushion their failures. I was never a daughter or a sister to them. I was a heavily fortified reservoir of resources, waiting to be tapped. For years, they had operated a quiet, insidious system of parasitic extraction, slowly draining my energy and my finances while offering absolutely nothing in return. The wedding in Sedona was merely the moment they decided to stop asking for my money and simply learned how to take it by force. They had pushed the exploitation to its absolute most brazen limit, assuming I would remain their silent, obedient mechanism of financial salvation. They were about to learn exactly what happens when the mechanism decides to shut the entire system down. The glass doors of my corner office at Alderon Contract Systems are heavy and soundproof. I was in the middle of reviewing a massive vendor compliance audit on Thursday afternoon when those doors were violently shoved open. My executive assistant stood in the hallway, looking completely horrified, apologizing profusely that she could not stop them in time. My mother and my brother stormed into my professional sanctuary. They looked completely unhinged. The manicured, calculated composure Elaine displayed at the desert gates was entirely gone. Grant looked pale and physically ill. They had clearly just received the formal legal notices from Rowan Pike. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I simply instructed my assistant to close the door and hold all my calls for the next 15 minutes. Then I folded my hands on my polished desk and waited. I let the sheer, suffocating weight of my silence crush the air out of the room. Grant broke first. He paced the length of the carpet, his hands running frantically through his hair. He started with a pathetic, whining plea. He swore up and down that he honestly thought I knew everything about the billing structure. He pointed a trembling finger at Elaine and loudly claimed that our mother assured him I was handling the overflow just like I always did. He actually used the phrase, just like always. In his warped mind, my past financial bailouts were not desperate rescues. They were establishing a permanent contractual precedent. Elaine immediately stepped forward to shield her golden boy. She slammed her designer handbag onto one of my guest chairs and commanded me to call off my attack dogs. She waved a crumpled copy of the legal preservation notice in the air. She called the entire situation a minor family oversight. She insisted that dragging lawyers and state investigators into a simple financial misunderstanding was a vindictive, disgusting abuse of my corporate power. I kept my face completely blank. I did not offer a single word of argument. I did not defend my actions in negotiations. Silence is the most devastating weapon you can deploy against a panicked opponent. When people are drowning in their own guilt and you refuse to throw them a conversational life preserver, they will frantically pull themselves under. My continued silence drove Elaine absolutely insane. Her voice grew shriller, her volume rising as she desperately tried to provoke a reaction. She demanded to know why I was being so incredibly stingy. She stated that my salary was more than enough to cover the remaining balance without severely impacting my lifestyle. She completely dropped the pretense of borrowing or misunderstanding. As the seconds ticked by, her frantic rationalizations laid bare the ugly, fundamental truth of our family dynamic. They viewed my individual income as a communal asset. To them, my bank account was simply a family trust fund that I was selfishly hoarding. Grant, sensing that Elaine was losing control of the narrative, tried a different tactic. He leaned over my desk, his voice dropping to a desperate, aggressive whisper. He begged me to just release the legal freeze on the vendor payments. He said he would figure out a way to pay me back eventually. But then his panic overrode his filter, and he accidentally exposed the true depth of his current disaster. He blurted out that his new father-in-law had a massive seed capital investment lined up for his fake real estate company, but the patriarch was completely freezing the funds until the embarrassing resort balance was fully settled. Grant had just handed me the final piece of his motive on a silver platter. The wedding was not just a social flex, it was a required transactional step to unlock Mercer family money. By freezing the payment, I had accidentally placed a tourniquet directly on his only source of future income. Elaine saw the cold realization dawn in my eyes and completely lost her temper. She realized she could not intimidate me in my own corporate environment. In a final, desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, she decided to weaponize the truth I had already uncovered. She leaned forward and sneered, her face twisted with bitter resentment. She told me I brought this entire situation on myself. She confessed, loud and clear, that she was the one who told the Mercer family I had severe emotional outbursts. She stated she had to do it. She had to ban me from the property, because my rigid, unyielding attitude would have ruined the most important financial opportunity of her son and his entire miserable life. She thought the confession would hurt me. She thought admitting she assassinated my character to secure a payday would finally make me crack and cry in front of them. Instead, I slowly reached forward, picked up my desk phone, and pressed the intercom button. I calmly instructed my assistant to call building security and have 2 unauthorized trespassers escorted out of the lobby. Grant looked like he was going to vomit. Elaine stood frozen, her mouth slightly open in shock. They finally realized that the dutiful, forgiving sister they had relied on for years was completely dead. I did not say a single word to them as the uniformed guards arrived and physically guided them out of my office. That evening, I returned to my quiet house. The adrenaline of the afternoon confrontation had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I was making dinner when the doorbell rang. I opened the front door to find a private courier standing on the porch. He handed me a small, heavily taped cardboard box, required my signature, and left immediately. The return address was left completely blank, but the handwriting on the mailing label belonged to my father. I took the box to my home office and sliced through the tape with a letter opener. Inside, resting on a bed of bubble wrap, was a black portable hard drive and a thick envelope containing a handwritten letter. I unfolded the letter first. It was from Robert. The handwriting was shaky, a stark visual representation of a man whose conscience had finally crushed his cowardice. He wrote that he had spent his entire life avoiding conflict with Elaine, choosing quiet complicity over doing the right thing. But watching his wife actively attempt to destroy his daughter to protect his son was a line he could no longer cross. He wrote that he could not allow me to be the scapegoat for their greed any longer. I plugged the hard drive into my computer and opened the primary directory. There were 2 digital files inside. The first file was a high-definition video clip extracted from the hidden security camera system my father had installed in their basement years ago. I clicked play. The black and white footage clearly showed Elaine walking down the stairs, approaching my sealed plastic storage bin. The timestamp in the corner of the video perfectly matched the dates I had previously pulled from the forged documents. I watched in crystal clear resolution as my mother broke the physical seal on the box, rummaged through my private files, and pulled out the exact folder containing my corporate tax documents and signature cards. It was undeniable, irrefutable visual proof of premeditated theft. The second file was a saved digital voicemail recording. It was a message Grant had left on my father and his cellular phone roughly 2 weeks before the wedding. I turned up the volume on my speakers. Grant sounded frantic and highly annoyed. He explicitly told our father to stop asking questions about the vendor contracts. Grant demanded that Robert stay completely out of it and let Mom handle the money thing. He stated clearly that as long as nobody panicked, the business account would absorb the shock and they could sort it out after the honeymoon. I sat back in my chair, the voices of my family echoing in the silent room. But the most explosive piece of evidence was not digital. It was the second piece of paper inside the envelope. It was a small, legally binding memorandum, dated exactly 1 month prior. It contained a single-typed paragraph stating that the Hudson family was in full consensus regarding the financial obligations of the upcoming event, and that I was fully aware and supportive of the arrangements. At the bottom of the page was my father and his signature, in his letter. Robert confessed exactly how this document came to exist. He explained that Elaine had cornered him in the kitchen one evening, shoving the paper in front of him. She brazenly lied to his face. She told Robert that the event planner simply needed a generic statement of family unity for their internal file, just a formality to ensure everyone was on the same page. She explicitly promised him that I had already read and verbally approved the document. Robert admitted he signed it because it was easier than arguing with her. But when the massive legal notices from my attorney arrived at their house that morning, he realized the terrifying truth. Elaine had used his signature as a secondary layer of authentication, a backup document to convince the resort that the entire family, including the patriarch, was fully authorizing the corporate charges. My father was the missing link. He was the vague, quiet shadow in the background of their scheme. But with this package, he had just completely destroyed their defense. He had voluntarily provided the physical evidence of the theft, the audio evidence of the conspiracy, and a signed confession detailing exactly how Elaine had fraudulently obtained his supporting signature through deliberate deception. Robert had just transformed himself from a passive bystander into a highly cooperative, deeply remorseful star witness. The game board shifted entirely in that exact moment. They thought they were fighting a simple corporate billing dispute. They had absolutely no idea that I was now holding the very weapons they used to build their lies, handed to me directly by the man who shared their home. The panic they felt in my office earlier that day was nothing compared to the absolute devastation I was preparing to unleash. By 8 o'clock on Friday morning, Rowan Pike had unleashed the full, devastating weight of his boutique law firm upon every single entity involved in the desert wedding. Rowan does not draft polite inquiries. He drafts legal warfare. He formally filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit in the district court. Simultaneously, he lodged a severe notary complaint regarding the falsified authorization signatures on the event contracts. He filed emergency injunctions demanding an immediate, total freeze on any and all financial obligations currently tied to my defunct limited liability company. Most importantly, he dispatched aggressive, legally binding preservation notices to the resort management team and every single independent vendor, strictly forbidding the destruction, alteration, or concealment of any internal communications, billing ledgers, or digital access logs. The trap was no longer just a concept in my mind. The steel jaws were actively locking into place across multiple state lines. The shockwaves of those legal filings rippled outward with terrifying speed and precision. In the insular, highly guarded world of regional private equity, whispers of a formal fraud investigation are infinitely more toxic than any social scandal or messy divorce. The Mercer family caught wind of the preservation notices before the weekend even began. Panic, pure and highly destructive, immediately set in. The patriarch of the Mercer family, a man who had spent 40 years building a pristine corporate reputation, realized his brand new son-in-law was about to drag his family name into a federal identity theft probe. Desperate to insulate his empire, he immediately ordered his elite legal team to sever any visible ties between his daughter and the contested invoices. This sudden, brutal withdrawal of financial and legal support shattered the fragile, opportunistic alliance between the newlyweds. The beautiful, highly curated fairy tale romance instantly dissolved into vicious, bitter infighting. According to a series of panicked, pathetic voicemails Grant left on my blocked phone log, he and Sloan were violently tearing each other apart in their luxury honeymoon villa, each frantically trying to pin the legal liability onto the other to save their own skin. The desperation reached its absolute peak on Monday afternoon when my private office line rang. It was not my mother demanding obedience. It was not my brother begging for a bailout. It was Sloan Mercer. Her voice, usually dripping with the effortless entitlement of generational wealth and carefully practiced elegance, was thin, strained, and trembling with barely contained terror. She did not bother with formal pleasantries or fake apologies. She immediately offered me a highly confidential, very lucrative private settlement agreement. Sloan promised to personally wire me the entire $45,000 to clear the resort balance from her own private, untouchable trust fund. She even offered a generous secondary sum, an extra $20,000, supposedly to compensate for my emotional distress. But in the world of the ultra-wealthy, money always comes with chains. There was one single, non-negotiable condition attached to her silent payoff. She demanded that I sign an ironclad, legally binding non-disclosure agreement and explicitly confirm, in writing on the official court record, that the entire fraudulent billing scheme was solely the fault of Elaine and Grant Hudson. She wanted me to officially exonerate her and her cousin Preston Vance, allowing her to walk away with clean hands while leaving my own mother and brother to face the criminal fraud charges completely alone. I listened to her frantic, hyperventilating bargaining, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical contempt. I did not accept her hush money. I calmly informed Sloan that my professional integrity, my stolen corporate identity, and the truth of what happened that weekend were not for sale at any price, let alone a discount offered by a coward. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. Instead of accepting a dirty, quiet payoff in the shadows to protect the guilty, I countered with a massive formal demand. I instructed Rowan to officially propose a mandatory pre-litigation mediation session. I insisted it be held in a neutral, highly secure corporate boardroom in Phoenix, Arizona. I stipulated that the mediation was strictly and unconditionally contingent upon the physical attendance of every single involved party. I demanded that my mother, my brother, Sloan, their respective legal representatives, the primary vendor management from Desert Vale Events, and the lead corporate counsel for Ember Canyon Estate all sit together at the exact same table at the exact same time. I was incredibly careful about the precise language I instructed Rowan to use in the official mediation invitations. I deliberately revealed absolutely nothing about the massive, crushing mountain of irrefutable evidence I had accumulated over the past week. The formal letters simply stated that I was willing to explore a civilized, comprehensive resolution to the unfortunate family misunderstanding, provided all the primary signers, the internal confirmers, and the ultimate financial beneficiaries were present to openly discuss the equitable allocation of the disputed debt. It was a perfectly crafted illusion of weakness and conciliation. The bait worked flawlessly. Elaine, blinded by her own staggering arrogance and her lifelong habit of successfully manipulating my emotions, immediately interpreted the mediation offer as a desperate white flag. She convinced herself that I was finally backing down, terrified of permanently destroying the family reputation in a very public, very messy courtroom battle. Grant, equally deluded by his own ego, eagerly agreed to attend. He firmly believed that if he could just get me into a room and deploy his usual pathetic, little boy charm, his older sister would inevitably fold, absorb the massive debt, and magically save him from the wrath of his terrifying new father-in-law. They both genuinely thought I was organizing a quiet, embarrassing family surrender. They thought I just wanted to be heard before I opened my checkbook. They had absolutely no idea what I was actually building in the silence. I spent the next 72 hours locked inside my home office, meticulously assembling the precise instrument of their total destruction. I did not prepare a list of emotional grievances. I did not write a tearful, cathartic speech about broken trust or childhood trauma. I prepared a massive, incredibly heavy, 3-ring legal binder. I organized the physical contents with ruthless, chronological precision, tracking the entire conspiracy down to the exact minute it was executed. The first tabbed section contained the raw Internet Protocol login data and the fraudulent password reset logs, firmly tying the initial digital breach directly to the internet router in my parents' living room. The second section held the vividly printed, time-stamped copies of the malicious group chat orchestrating my physical removal from the resort premises, proving Sloan was the mastermind of my exclusion. The third section contained the high-resolution digital scans of the forged limited liability company documents, paired directly with still frames from the black and white security camera footage showing Elaine actively stealing those exact files from my basement storage bin. The fourth section held a perfectly transcribed copy of the audio recording where Grant laughed hysterically about using me as a walking emergency fund. The final sections contained the complete, unredacted vendor routing timelines, proving the massive internal kickbacks to Sloan and her cousin. right alongside the sworn, signed, and notarized affidavit from Nora Bell. Every single page was slipped inside a clear plastic protective sleeve. Every single document was cross-referenced and legally indexed. The binder was 3 inches thick, heavy enough to cause physical damage, and packed with enough undeniable truth to ruin multiple lives permanently. The trap was completely set, the evidence was perfectly bound, and the invisible walls of the boardroom were rapidly closing in. By late Wednesday afternoon, Rowan Pike called my secure line and forwarded me the final batch of email confirmations. Every single person had officially agreed to attend the session in Phoenix. My mother, my brother, the wealthy bride, the defensive luxury vendors, and all the corporate lawyers had officially RSVP'd to the event. As I closed the heavy black cover of the binder, the sharp, metallic snapping sound of the rings echoed loudly in the quiet room, sounding exactly like a closing cell door. I was not flying back to the desert to have a civilized conversation about family values. I was not going to negotiate a settlement, and I was certainly not going to cry for their mercy. I had invited them to that secure room for one single, terrifying purpose. I was going to force every single liar to sit down, look across the polished mahogany table, and face the absolute, undeniable, and financially ruinous version of their true selves. The pre-litigation mediation took place in a high-rise corporate boardroom in downtown Phoenix. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a blinding, panoramic view of the relentless desert landscape. The air conditioning pumped a steady, freezing current into the massive space, completely neutralizing the blistering heat radiating outside the windows. I arrived a full 2 hours before the scheduled start time. I did not want to walk into a room they already occupied and ask for a seat at the table. I wanted them to walk into my domain. I chose the heavy leather chair at the absolute head of the long mahogany table. I placed my thick black binder squarely in front of me, aligning the edges perfectly with the wood grain. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my hair pulled back severely. I had completely shed the ghost of the discarded sister left grieving outside a resort gate. I was the owner of the files, the architect of the audit, and the room was entirely mine. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy wooden double doors swung open. Elaine walked in first. She wore a flawless, custom-tailored cream suit, her posture aggressively perfect. She carried herself with the terrifying, delusional confidence of a woman who genuinely believed she was walking into a routine family negotiation where she could simply scold me into submission and sweep the mess under the rug. She offered a tight, artificial smile to the room, attempting to immediately establish herself as the reasonable matriarch trying to calm a hysterical daughter. Grant followed closely behind her, and the physical contrast was shocking. He looked utterly hollowed out. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, his skin carried a sickly gray pallor, and his expensive designer suit hung loosely on his drooping shoulders. The past week of severe marital warfare and impending financial doom had clearly broken him. Next came Sloane, flanked by a very expensive, very ruthless-looking corporate litigator. She refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room, hiding her panicked expression behind thick designer sunglasses until she took her seat at the far opposite end of the table. Finally, the corporate representatives filed in. The lead legal counsel for Ember Canyon Estate took a seat on the left, opening a thick yellow legal pad. The fraud investigator representing the third-party payment processing firm sat quietly beside him, his expression entirely unreadable. The silence in the room was suffocating. The tension physically vibrated against the glass windows. I did not open the mediation with a dramatic, emotional speech. I did not hurl loud accusations across the table or demand immediate tearful apologies. I simply nodded to the resort attorney, silently granting him the floor. I wanted them to build their own gallows before I pulled the lever. The attorney cleared his throat, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and initiated the formal proceedings. He looked around the table and calmly asked everyone to explain, in their own unvarnished words, the exact sequence of events that led to the disputed balance. He asked who specifically proposed using my corporate entity as the primary financial guarantor. He asked who physically transmitted the digital authorization files to the resort accounting department. He asked who actively approved the tens of thousands of dollars in last-minute luxury upgrades. I sat perfectly still and listened to them weave their beautiful, desperate web of lies. Elaine spoke first, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone of maternal sorrow. She looked directly at the resort attorney and stated that I had always been the financial bedrock of the family. She claimed, with astonishing conviction, that we had a long-standing, implicit verbal agreement regarding the wedding expenses. She painted a picture where my current dispute was simply a sudden, unpredictable emotional outburst, a tragic misunderstanding of a financial responsibility I had supposedly already accepted out of love for my brother. When the attorney turned his gaze to Grant, my brother kept his eyes glued to the polished wood of the table. He mumbled that he knew absolutely nothing about the back-end billing logistics. He claimed he was just the groom, entirely focused on the stress of the ceremony, and that he blindly trusted his mother to handle the boring financial paperwork. He completely threw Elaine directly into the line of fire to save his own skin. Then, Sloan and her litigator spoke. The lawyer confidently asserted that his client and her wealthy family were completely insulated from the Hudson family dynamics. He stated Sloan operated under the pure assumption that the family of the groom was handling their portion of the billing internally, and that she had absolutely zero knowledge of any unauthorized corporate utilization. The representative for the middleman vendor, Preston Vance and his proxy, actively dodged making any direct statement at all, vaguely citing pending internal corporate reviews. I let their lies hang in the freezing air of the boardroom. I let them exchange brief, relieved glances, foolishly believing their coordinated wall of plausible deniability was holding strong against the corporate lawyers. Then, I placed my hands flat on the table. The subtle physical movement drew every single eye in the room toward me. My voice was low, perfectly measured, and entirely devoid of emotion. I stated that before we discussed the equitable distribution of the outstanding debt, I required the direct answers to exactly 3 specific logistical questions. I looked directly into Elaine and her eyes and asked my first question. I asked who possessed the physical key to the basement in the Westerville residence, specifically the room housing my sealed document archives. Elaine blinked, her perfect posture faltering for a fraction of a second, but she remained silent. I turned my absolute gaze to Grant and asked my second question. I asked who currently paid the monthly service bill for the legacy landline phone sitting on our parents' kitchen counter. The exact phone number utilized to intercept a secure digital password reset protocol 2 months ago. Grant swallowed hard, the remaining color draining completely from his face. Finally, I looked straight down the length of the table at Sloan. I asked my third question. I asked why the primary logistical command team had explicitly flagged my physical identity with a highly restricted security designation on their internal documents. Nobody answered. The silence was absolute and agonizing. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the heavy black cover of my binder. I bypassed the hundreds of pages of digital network logs and banking records. I reached into the clear front pocket and extracted an 8x10 color photograph printed on heavy, glossy paper. I slid the photograph across the smooth mahogany surface, letting it come to a slow, deliberate stop dead center, equidistant from my mother, my brother, and the wealthy bride. The image was undeniable. The harsh black marker on the logistical clipboard glared under the bright fluorescent lights of the boardroom. The words, "Do not admit" and "financial only" stared back at them like a physical blow. The entire room seemed to physically jolt. The resort attorney stopped writing mid-sentence, his pen hovering frozen above his legal pad. The payment processor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing sharply at the physical evidence. The carefully constructed masks of innocence shattered instantly into 1,000 jagged pieces. Panic is a highly corrosive acid, and it ate through their familial loyalty in a matter of seconds. Elaine lost her refined composure completely. Her voice pitched upward into a frantic, shrill register as she pointed wildly at the photograph, desperately claiming the event planners must have maliciously misunderstood a simple request for family privacy. She tried to blame the innocent resort staff for writing the cruel directive. Grant, realizing the horrifying magnitude of the premeditation, violently turned on his new wife. He slammed his fist on the table and demanded to know what she had told her coordination team behind his back. Sloane sat entirely rigid, her mouth slightly open in genuine, unfiltered shock. She was not shocked by the cruelty of the words written on the page. She was utterly paralyzed by the terrifying realization that Nora Bell, a junior assistant she had treated like invisible hired help, had quietly documented her malice and handed it directly to the enemy. Sloane and her lawyer frantically leaned together, the attorney whispering urgently into her ear, desperately trying to silence her before she incriminated herself further on the official record. The pristine, elegant family they pretended to be had completely devolved into a loud, pathetic pit of cornered animals, viciously biting at each other to escape the steel trap I had built around them. I did not smile. I did not interrupt their pathetic, desperate infighting to gloat. I simply sat back in my leather chair and watched them bleed out the last remnants of their dignity onto the boardroom table. When the shouting and the finger-pointing reached a chaotic, deafening crescendo, I slowly reached out my right hand. I placed my index finger directly onto the small black audio playback remote, resting neatly beside my open binder. I pressed the power button, bringing the portable speaker to life with a soft, electronic chime that instantly cut through their yelling. The room fell into a sudden, terrified, breathless silence as they looked at the speaker and realized I was not finished. I looked around the table one last time, making sure every single person was making direct eye contact with me, and delivered the shortest, coldest sentence of the entire ordeal. Good. Now let us listen to the rest. I connected my encrypted laptop to the massive digital monitor mounted on the far wall of the boardroom. I did not say another word as I executed the final sequence of my presentation. I clicked the first file, and the glowing screen immediately displayed the high-definition digital captures of the private group chat. The explicit text messages where Sloane commanded her planning team to completely erase my room booking and forcefully hold me at the security gates were blown up to 5 feet tall for every single person in the room to read. Sloane physically shrank down into her expensive leather chair, her face draining of all color as her own malicious words were projected in blinding white light. Next, I pressed the playback button for the audio file. The unmistakable sound of Grant and his arrogant laughter filled the freezing air of the room. We all sat in absolute silence and listened to the groom happily refer to his own flesh and blood as a walking emergency fund. We listened to him boast to his friends that my physical absence from the official photographs was the only thing that truly mattered, as long as my stolen credit line remained wide open. The echo of his voice bounced off the glass windows, entirely obliterating the pathetic, innocent victim routine he had tried to sell to the corporate lawyers just 10 minutes prior. Grant stared blankly at his own shaking hands, completely paralyzed by his own exposed cruelty. Then, I played the third and final piece of digital evidence. The black and white security footage from my parents' house rolled onto the massive screen. The entire table watched Elaine creep down the basement stairs, casually break the physical seal on my private storage bin, and systematically steal my sensitive corporate tax documents. The visual proof of her premeditated theft was absolutely undeniable. Before Elaine could even attempt to open her mouth and manufacture a new, desperate lie to explain away the video footage, a chair scraped loudly against the floor at the very back of the room. My father, Robert, had been sitting quietly in the shadows near the corner since the mediation began, completely ignored by his panicked wife and son. He stood up slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked directly across the length of the table at the lead attorney for Ember Canyon Estate. Robert stated, for the official legal record, that he had been aggressively manipulated and lied to by his own wife. He confessed that he was forced into signing the fraudulent family consensus note under extreme false pretenses. He then reached into his jacket, pulled out his own cellular phone, and played the saved voicemail where Grant explicitly ordered him to stay completely silent about the money until the honeymoon was over. The fraud investigator representing the third-party payment processing firm had heard absolutely enough. He aggressively snapped his laptop shut. He looked directly at the venue management team and formally declared his findings. He stated that after cross-referencing the internet protocol addresses, verifying the exact minute of the password reset, and authenticating the fraudulent security bypass methods, it was entirely legally conclusive that Madison Hudson did not authorize a single cent of the charges. The lead attorney for the luxury resort immediately nodded in agreement. Without a single second of hesitation, the venue attorney formally announced that my defunct limited liability company was completely cleared of the $45,000 debt. He declared that the resort was instantly shifting the entirety of the financial liability directly onto the individuals who physically signed the final catering contracts and consumed the luxury services. They were already drowning, but my attorney, Rowan Pike, decided to throw an anvil to them. Rowan stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and smoothly distributed thick stacks of paper to the resort attorneys and the fraud investigators. He laid out the complete, unredacted vendor routing files. He meticulously demonstrated exactly how a massive portion of the wedding costs was artificially inflated through Desert Vale events. He drew a perfectly straight, undeniable line connecting the fraudulent price gouging directly to Preston Vance, and by direct extension, to Sloan and her family. He proved that the bride and her relatives were actively running a cash kickback scheme, using my stolen corporate identity to line their own pockets. Sloan and her high-priced litigator sat in stunned, defeated silence. They could no longer hide behind the excuse of being ignorant bystanders to my family drama. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom swung open. The patriarch of the Mercer family, who had quietly arrived halfway through the proceedings to secretly monitor the potential damage to his corporate empire, stepped into the light. He had stood in the hallway and listened to the entire grotesque display of fraud and incompetence. He looked at Grant with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. In a voice cold enough to freeze boiling water, Mr. Mercer announced that every single dollar of the post-wedding investment capital he had promised to Grant was permanently and irrevocably revoked. The marriage, which Grant had ruthlessly orchestrated to be his golden ticket into the upper echelons of society, had just instantly transformed into a massive, suffocating financial landmine buried right beneath his own feet. Realizing she had lost absolutely everything: her social standing, her son and his wealthy future, and her own legal immunity, Elaine tried one final, desperate maneuver. She completely abandoned her arrogant, aggressive posture and burst into loud, theatrical tears. She reached her hands across the polished mahogany table, grasping desperately toward me. She wailed loudly about our shared blood, begging for my forgiveness. She cried that a family should never destroy each other over something as trivial as money, completely ignoring the fact that she was the one who initiated the destruction. But I responded to her tears with the absolute cruelest weapon you can ever deploy against people who survive entirely by manipulating human emotions. I used the cold, clinical truth. I did not yell at her. I did not cry. I did not offer her a single ounce of closure or emotional validation. I simply opened my binder, looked her dead in the eye, and read the exact legal statutes of corporate fraud and identity theft aloud. I read the maximum penal codes right to her face, in front of the financial representatives, the corporate lawyers, and her own devastated husband. The final outcome of the Phoenix mediation was absolute and completely devastating. My name and my corporate entity were permanently erased from every single invoice and legal contract associated with the event. Grant, Elaine, Sloan, and the corrupt vendors were left completely alone to face a massive mountain of real, inescapable debt. They were immediately subjected to aggressive civil lawsuits from the resort management and active criminal fraud investigations by the state financial authorities. In the quiet aftermath of the legal slaughter, I did not celebrate my victory with triumphant screams or joyful tears. When the boardroom finally emptied, leaving only the smell of expensive cologne and ruined lives behind, I simply packed my files back into my black binder and walked out into the blinding, beautiful Arizona sun. Several weeks later, I took the personal money I had originally saved to buy Grant a generous wedding gift. combined it with the funds I successfully protected from their theft, and quietly established a small, highly dedicated legal aid fund. I designed the foundation specifically to provide aggressive corporate legal representation for women who are actively being financially abused, manipulated, and drained by their own toxic families. 3 days before the ceremony, I was forcefully banned from stepping foot inside the lavish desert wedding of my only brother. But when the dust finally settled, I was the only person who walked away with all the power, completely unburdened and entirely free. They thought they could erase me from the picture, but I was the one who wrote the only conclusion that truly made this entire story worth telling until the very last minute. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.